Hello, welcome everybody. We're just gonna give folks a few minutes to log in. Welcome everyone to our first webinar of the year, our Innovations in Language Assessment webinar series, hosted by Anthony Coonan, who I will introduce here in a moment. Welcome to the webinar. Greetings from Pittsburgh. It's very cold and snowy here, has been for hours. We're glad to have you here, wherever you're and whenever you're tuning in around the world. I see a raised hand. I'm just going to orient people to the experience of the webinar. I know a lot of you folks have tuned into previous iterations of this series, so you know the drill. But as audience members, you don't have access to your camera or your microphone, but you do have a few different ways to communicate with us. Please feel free to use the chat to connect with each other. Let us know where you're dialing in from, say hi and things like that. If you have a question for our presenter that you'd like her to address, you can use the Q&A function that's also in the bottom tab there, and you can submit a question, and then after the presentation I'll read out the questions that you've submitted, and Jill can take a little time to respond to them after the presentation. Another common question is, will we be recording this webinar? Yes, we will. We record every webinar in this series and post them on the DET's Assessment Research YouTube channel, and I'll post that link in the chat. And I'll post it again too if folks log on later. But you can find all of the recordings for the previous webinars in this series, and this one will be up shortly after we're done. So if you want to revisit it or share it with somebody that wasn't able to attend, you can use that link. I'm going to give people just a few more minutes to log in. Also, if you're interested in checking out any of our research, including the responsible AI standards that we published last year, you can check out our research page. Just share that link in the chat as well. So, okay, Anthony, I'm gonna hand it over to you. Gonna pass it on to Dr. Anthony Coonan, my colleague at the DET, and he will introduce our speaker.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to our Innovations in Language Assessment series. We are very excited today to have with us Dr. Jill Burstein, who's a principal assessment scientist at the Duolingo English test. The topic for today's talk will be responsible AI standards in assessment. And before we start, I'd like to say a few words about Jill. She received her PhD in linguistics from the City University of New York Graduate Center, and she led the team that invented AERA, automated essay scoring system developed at Educational Testing Service in Princeton. And this has also been embedded in Criterion online writing evaluation. But that was in the past. I have the book here, which is a 2003 edition. There's a later edition, 2013, and there's an even newer volume that's coming out, to which Jill has contributed the foreword. Currently, for the last few years, Jill has been the lead on the validation and outreach team, and she has led many projects for the DET. And I'm glad to be here to welcome Jill to do this presentation. So over to Jill. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. I hope everyone can hear me. Sophie, I noticed you have a poll up.
Yes, yeah, we just were interested in what folks are bringing to the table in terms of experience with AI and how it might be relevant to your field of study. So if you want to just respond to that poll where we're asking what your professional background is, I can leave it up for a few more minutes. No, I'm gonna see it now. I can see it now. Let me see. It's not really letting me look at it very much, Jill. I'm sorry. Oh no, here we go. We've got a PhD in English. We've got EFL and ESL, assessment research, TESOL, licensure assessment, English teaching, a lot of research. We got neuroscience. Let's see, teacher educator, theoretical linguistics, applied linguistics, assessment and measurement. We've got some grad students and some PhD candidates, an assessment specialists, software engineer. That's a good summary.
So we have a nice mix. It's always nice to know who's listening, since I can't see anyone, so I have to picture people. Anyway, I'm Jill Burstein, as Anthony introduced me, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about the responsible AI standards and assessment, and in particular, what we're doing at the Duolingo English test. And so for our agenda today is I want to start with some level setting to make sure we're all on the same page about AI and responsible AI definitions. I will talk to you about responsible AI as professional responsibility in our assessment community. And then I'll present a case study for that and talk about responsible AI in particular for the DET and give you some takeaways. And then we will move forward with a Q&A if anyone has questions. So as Sophie said, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. So just to start with some level setting, responsible AI is increasingly relevant. Maybe you've heard about it. Maybe this is new to you. If you're familiar with the Google Trends application, Google Trends, you can just Google Trends, search for it. And it's an application that Google provides that allows you to put in a term and it'll track that term in terms of how many internet searches it's had given a particular period of time. And the other day I typed in responsible AI and you can see sort of the bump. You can see how, in 2019, 2020, earlier 2022, there was a much lower search rate than there was last year around November. And we all kind of know about ChatGPT and OpenAI and what happened there. And it looks like, except for Christmas time of this year, winter breaks, there was a pretty big bump in the internet search for the term responsible AI. So it's become something that the term is out there, it's important, and people are interested, it seems, learning more about it.
Jill, I just wanted to remind you that we were going to also launch another quick poll to kind of get a sense from the audience about their familiarity with the concept of responsible
so maybe
AI.
I'll go back. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Sophie,
so this is just a simple 3-answer poll if you want to take a few minutes to just to give us a sense of where people are in terms of their familiarity with the concept. Just going to give it a few minutes to run, Jill. I know you can't see anything, but people are submitting their answers.
Okay, great.
All the time. So let's just see. We've got a pretty high answer rate. I'm going to give it one more moment as people submit. Okay. So what I'm seeing right now is actually, I can probably just share it with you. I'll go ahead and do that. We've got 32% people just getting started. 55% have some knowledge, still learning, and 13% are saying they are already using it in their daily professional life. So it's a pretty good mix.
So are you ready to move on?
I think so.
It sounds like maybe you'll learn something new today, I hope. Just the point. So what is responsible AI, or at least how are we defining it? So AI, as you're probably all aware, is prominent in our everyday lives. We have safety sensors in cars, Google Translate, internet search, speech recognition, and customer service. And responsible AI is the practice of creating and using AI that's not only useful, but also safe and ethical. And so some of the common pillars in AI or in responsible AI are fairness. So if you think about algorithmic bias, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation, privacy and security. So examples like data governance and accountability, user awareness. So making sure that users know that they're interacting with an AI system. And AI has broad use and there are shared RAI or response. I'll start using the term RAI just as an abbreviation as we go through this, shared RAI concerns across different sectors. So education is not the only, we're not the only sector using AI or thinking or having the concerns about responsible AI. So in education, automated scoring for writing assessment is fairly popular. Law enforcement, there's facial recognition for surveillance, healthcare, wearable trackers, with your iPhone, tracks your steps for health monitoring. In media, we have fake news detection, detecting hate speech, and there are a number of uses and sectors share many of the same concerns about responsible AI. And an example is that, so useful, smart, really well-intended AI has risks. And so this is the why, and why we're talking about responsible AI today and why it's important. And the reason I'm showing this book, Unmasking AI, is it presents a really poignant case about the risks of well-intended AI and in the context of facial recognition. And I highly recommend this book for anyone who's listening right now. It's not technical, speaks to a broad audience. I'm in the middle of it and I'm really enjoying it. But Dr. Joy, as she refers to herself, she talks about her path in facial recognition. And while it's convenient and it's fun for daily use, and we use it for unlocking our iPhones, or many of us do, there's an issue of underrepresentation in training data that can cause harm in high stakes contexts. So if you're familiar with the way AI models are built, just briefly, lots of examples are used. They're collected in order to train the system or build a model. And if, for instance, if you're training a model to recognize faces, and in your examples, you don't have diversity, then that can cause problems for the model. And that can have implications for really high stakes contexts. And so, for instance, in her book, she talks about faces with darker skin being falsely identified, or not being recognized at all, being falsely identified, actually resulting in incarceration. And think about, what if in a self-driving car, a face is not recognized? That could be a real problem, could cause somebody some serious injury. So while we may be very well intended in what we're doing with AI, the critical importance of responsible AI is shown here. And we really need to think about how we're going to deal with the risks of AI, as well intended as our applications might be. And so that's where professional responsibility comes in. And so I want to talk about responsible AI in terms of our professional responsibility generally and as a community. So I want to first talk about human-centered AI, and then assessment community standards, and then the idea of responsible AI guidelines versus standards. So human-centered AI embraces human values in the development of AI systems, just to give you some context and grounding. And the theory in responsible AI specifies a number of human value pillars, and there's a lot of research about this. You can look it up after the talk if you're interested. And the pillars generally are concepts like fairness, transparency, explainability, privacy, security, trust, responsibility, which we'll talk about today, justice, which we'll also talk about, and autonomy. And so our community, if we think about the traditional frameworks kind of predating the explosion of AI, or even the use of AI, they also embrace human values, right? So they think about validity, so validity arguments, and the fact that frameworks that tell us about the need that the test needs to satisfy certain claims to demonstrate test taker proficiency, that tasks need to represent a domain, that scoring methods need to be appropriate and can be attributed to the domain. And this, of course, happened pre-AI, and it had to do with humans developing items and managing the scoring and making sure the construct was relevant. But these apply, of course, and I'll talk about it in the context of AI use as well. But even earlier, people were dealing with these issues, and human values were embedded in the thinking and the frameworks for assessment. And then fairness. So Kunan's framework and Randall's more recent framework, both deal with issues of justice, and tests should be justice-oriented and equitable for all test takers. So we're not starting from scratch here when we're thinking about responsibility in the assessment world. And so Feld et al. Has a really, I like, and I think is a very classic reference for principled artificial intelligence and thinking about ethics in AI and responsible AI. And they have, that article has a discussion of professional responsibility that I really like. And I've provided the responsibilities that they list and some examples. And I think that this is really a good framework for thinking about our community and professional responsibility in our community in the context of responsible AI. So responsibilities are that we ensure accuracy and scientific integrity. So examples from testing would be AI system evaluation for accuracy and bias, that we apply responsible design so that the test is accessible, it's secure, and there's a cultural awareness so that everybody can use it. And considering long-term effects, so that what's the test score's impact on test takers, and using multiple stakeholder collaboration, so making sure that there's a diverse human experts, for instance, in content review. And we've also put our standards out for public comment, so that's a way to also involve stakeholders. So if you're interested in this topic more broadly, I suggest this publication. So beyond guidelines, so right now there is a proliferation of guidelines in our community because there has been an explosion of AI and use of AI in education. We're trying to get our heads around everything that needs to be done, everything that needs to be looked at, all the guardrails. And so there is a proliferation of guidelines. And guidelines and standards are similar, but they also have differences. So they're similar in the fact that professional communities identify human values and scientific requirements for both of these things. But the guidelines that have been created, and what guidelines sort of are that they recommend guardrails that mitigate AI risk and align with human values. Whereas the standards, and we'll get into more detail later, they actually specify the guardrails for mitigating AI risk and aligning with human values. And there are specific processes that are then mapped to the standards, actionable processes to actually bear out the standards and make sure that your assessment is responsible for whatever product you're building. So it's not that we don't have standards in our community, we do. However, the AERA, APA, NCME standards that are the go-to for standards in educational measurement, they predate a lot of the work that is now embedded in our assessments. And so the standards that address responsible AI, before it was called responsible AI, but really in terms of validity, really focus on automated scoring. And I've listed some excerpts here. So for instance, standard 3.8 is the validity of score interpretations for relevant subgroups, and that any scoring algorithms that we use need to be reviewed for sources of bias. And that when algorithms are used, characteristics of responses should be documented along with the theoretical and empirical basis for the algorithm. And so the rationale, the example that's given as a practice in the standards is the rationale required to link test scores to the construct. And so we have a number of standards that address responsible AI, but they are limited to scoring, automated scoring. And so I want to talk to you now more specifically about the responsible AI standards for the DET. And so I'll do this in the context of a case study. And so I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with the Duolingo English test, so I'm just going to spend 30 seconds giving you a high-level overview, and you can read more about it. There's research on our website. So the Duolingo English test is what we call a digital-first test, and that means that it's born digital. What that means is that we didn't translate a paper test or into a computer-based test, but that we used AI extensively throughout the test, and everything starts out in a digital format. And the whole test is automatically generated and scored. I'll show that in a minute in the slide. It's a high-stakes English language assessment for higher ed admissions. It has quite large volumes right now, used by more than 4,900 programs in over 100 countries. And it evaluates speaking, writing, reading, and listening skills, as well as integrated skills of literacy, comprehension, conversation, and production. We use what we call human-in-the-loop AI extensively. So for instance, in the design process, item development, we use automated item generation and human review. For measurement, we use automated scoring and human annotation, as well as review of the scoring and for quality control. And in terms of security, we have automated plagiarism detection and human proctors. And so these are just a few examples of how the AI is used in concert with human experts. And so now thinking about it from the test taker perspective, the affordances of AI allow us to create a more comfortable experience for the test taker, what we call test taker experience, or TTX. And so the AI allows us to make the tests more convenient. And an example is that AI for online administration. So we can use AI to ensure secure at-home testing, which makes for a more convenient situation for test takers. One of the other examples is that it's faster, so we can ensure faster score turnaround through automated scoring. And the AI also contributes to the affordability. So leveraging AI allows us to create quality items at a lower cost. So those are a few examples of how it impacts test taker experience. So looking a little more closely at the RAI standards. So why are they really important? So the DET it's a high stakes test. It's AI powered, again, high stakes. And so it's life-changing for test takers. It can be a really meaningful difference in a test taker's life if they do well or not, and if they're accepted to a university or not. And so while this is all done with very good intentions, like the example that I showed before with facial recognition, just like other uses of AI, assessments need RAI standards to mitigate risks that could impact the test taker scores. So examples are evaluating accuracy in automated scoring of speech and writing, mitigating bias in automated item generation, and accurately detecting test taker cheating from plagiarism detection. And so I'll go into this more deeply as we go through the talk. And so to this end, what this looks like for us is that the DET has we've written our own responsible AI standards for our test. They're the first RAI standards for an assessment. And the pillars that we selected were validity and reliability to support a test validity argument, fairness to increase access and mitigate bias, privacy and security to protect test takers and the item bank, and accountability and transparency to share and engage with stakeholders, or test takers and test users. And so how do we do this? Just an overview of the responsible AI standards development process is that we first reviewed the standards, the guidelines and standards in our professional community. So the International Test Commission, ATP, and AERA, APA, NCME standards. So the ITC, ATP are guidelines, and then the AERA, APA, NCME are standards. And we looked through those and identified relevant factors for language assessment because, of course, the DET is a language assessment, right? And then we developed the 4 standards and related goals associated with the standards that are consistent with the assessment community recommendations. We collaborated and had these reviewed by experts in AI and responsible AI, law, and security. And we documented our processes, mapping them to our standards. So now just stepping back for a minute, the DET has a theoretical language assessment ecosystem, which you can read more about. And in this ecosystem are all the moving parts that are important to an assessment. And so just focusing on the test security, the item development or item design and measurement, and also test taker experience. These are all the moving parts that sort of create the inside of the test, or the key components of the test. And it's our belief that these standards interact with security and item design and measurement and test taker experience. And so they're integral to our ecosystem. And so how are these RAI standards embedded, and how is the practice embedded? And so here are just a few examples, and we'll drill down later into a little more deeply. But if you think about the ecosystem, in terms of measurement, the validity and the reliability standard applies. And so an example would be AI system accuracy evaluation. So evaluating the accuracy of our automated essay scoring and speech scoring systems. And in terms of item development, fairness would apply. So fairness and bias, human item review process to mitigate any bias and that might interfere with the task's construct relevance. And then in terms of security, the REI standard of privacy and security. So storing and using data following data protection policies that are compliant, for instance, with the GDPR. And in terms of test taker experience, accountability and transparency, an example would be public dissemination of how we use AI on the DET. And so these are just some concrete examples. So now let's dig a little deeper. And let's think about how we translate these standards into practice. And I'll go through a couple of standards examples and practices that we use on the DET. So we'll talk about the fairness standard and human fairness and bias review for AI-generated test content, and also the privacy and security standard for plagiarism, and we'll look at plagiarism detection and remote proctoring. And so for our fairness standard, this sort of high-level rationale, and we write a lot more about this, obviously, in the standards document itself, but a high-level rationale is that it promotes social justice through access inclusion, representing test taker demographics. And one of the practices is to conduct fairness and bias item review for inclusion, making sure to eliminate construct-relevant barriers such as cultural and linguistic factors. And for those of you who are here and have an assessment background, fairness and bias review is not new. It's something that's been used for many years for tests that have been, items that have been developed by people, but we are using it in the context of evaluating, automatic item generation. So that's why it's very important to have it here as well, and continue the tradition of fairness and bias review. And so looking inside of our test development process, where does the human fairness and bias review process fit? So when we're thinking about developing items, generally speaking, we come up with a construct definition, we come up with a task design, we make sure that we have all of the AI tools, machine learning and NLP modeling that we need to be able to make this task work. And then when that's all done, we proceed to automatically generate the items. And after they're automatically generated, if you follow the orange arrow sort of through the diagram, we have this human in the loop AI process. So we've automatically generated some content, whether it's a passage or test question, and then human reviewers, expert human reviewers, go through and look at the item quality review and the fairness and bias review. And they perform a fairness and bias review. And so looking at the human fairness and bias review process, now drilling down a bit, this is how it happens. So people develop the fairness and bias review criteria to ensure that the automatically generated content is fair for test takers of different identities and backgrounds, cultural, socioeconomic, and gender. And then humans, again, hire and train a diverse group of human expert raters, linguists, and people with professional background in TESOL. And the human raters conduct item quality review. So they look at factors such as, are the prompts in the expected mode? If we're looking at writing prompts, are they actually argumentative and narrative? Or did that not quite work out in the automated system? So that's the item quality review. But then the human raters also conduct fairness and bias review to evaluate, they use the criteria that was developed for this, and they evaluate for bias in the prompt content or the reading passage content. And they look for things like, is the content too technically specific so that it maybe disadvantages some people who have more experience in some subject area than others, as well as linguistic and cultural specific knowledge. And then that's how the standards guide responsible item creation. And so that is one quick view of our human fairness and bias review process. And as you can see, here's an example of a test item that was developed. It's probably now not on the test, but maybe in the practice test. so that we're not leaking any items, but this is what a writing item might look like. And if you just take a few seconds to look at it, it looks fairly reasonable in terms of it should be understandable by many people who take the test. And so now looking a bit more at our privacy and security, I'm going to go a little bit more depth about this. It's a little bit more involved. So privacy and security is done to ensure that data compliance, test taker privacy, and to secure test administrate and to provide a secure test administration. And the practice that I'm going to talk about today is that we want to make sure that we offer our remote human proctors guidance and protocols for accurately identifying cases of test taker plagiarism, which is a really difficult issue to manage, but it happens. And so a little background about the DET and our remote proctoring. So the DET uses remote asynchronous proctoring, which means that there are no human proctors present at the time that the test taker is taking the test. And to that end, our test sessions are recorded. AI systems flag suspicious behaviors for proctors to review later. And every test session is reviewed by a human proctor using a tiered proctoring system. And the tiering represents the proctor's expertise. So first, we have first-tier proctors, and they're trained in certain security skills that allow them to identify suspicious test taker behavior, such as seeing other people coming in the room. The second-tier proctors have first-tier proctor security skills, but they also proctor the interview portion of the test or the speaking sample. And then the third-tier proctors, these are senior proctors. They have higher level security skills, and they proctor the most complex test cases. And so this is an overview of how our plagiarism detection process works. So we first have a clear definition of plagiarism, which I'll present in a moment. We have an algorithm for identifying potential sources of plagiarism. So where could this plagiarism actually come from? And I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. And we have an intertextuality detection system, which I'll talk about, that looks at text overlap. And then these automated AI systems generate interpretable outputs that are understandable and digestible for the remote proctors. And the remote proctors then have a user-friendly interface, which I'll show you, and clear guidance on the system usage and how to interpret everything and make decisions about plagiarism. And so here are definitions of plagiarism and intertextuality. So plagiarism is an intentional cheating behavior, whereby a test taker deliberately misrepresented what they wrote from an external source as their own in order to achieve a higher score. So, and then there's intertextuality, which is just a linguistic phenomenon of overlap between a new text and a source text. And we know that this can happen to some extent without it being actual, intentional cheating or plagiarism. So we have to make that distinction. It's tricky. And so in terms of identifying sources, where do we get our sources from? So just to give you a more concrete picture of this plagiarism detection system. So the internet serves to help us pull sources. So plagiarism sources may have been accessed via the internet, and this is useful if a test taker used a search engine during the test. So they may have accessed this, and so we have a database of sources from the internet. And then we also have a historical response database, and these are historical test taker responses, and they are useful if a test taker used a private brain dump shared by an earlier test taker. And a private brain dump is when someone, they either memorize or they write down or they somehow cull the example content or the content from the test, and they store it, and then they're able to distribute it publicly later. So it's a way for people to leak content. What's called a private brain dump. And so our remote proctors are able to, they have this interface, and they are then shown and trained on the text overlap. And so they see text overlap statistics. They are shown example of the response and past exams, so they can see if the response was maybe taken from like a historical test session, and how similar it looks, or if it was taken, how similar it might be to some internet content. And so this allows them to think about their decisions along with whatever training and guidance they get, which is significant, and then make decisions about, whether or not this response has been plagiarized or not, based on this evidence. And so an overview of the responsible AI test certification process is that, the test is uploaded, the plagiarism detection and intertextuality detection are run. Human proctors are then shown all this information. They're trained how to use it. They're trained how to review it. And based on their analysis, a certification decision is made. And so this is another example of, I presented the first example of the fairness and bias review as a process in our that's mapped to our fairness standard. And now this is a process that was mapped to our privacy and security standard. And so important takeaways from this whole discussion and why we need RAI standards in general, and sort of what they address and what they embrace, is that they address ethics, auditing, and science. So there's a lot going on in these standards. From an ethical perspective, they embrace human-centered AI, which speak to the human values that I mentioned earlier. They address professional responsibility. They foster human trust of AI among the stakeholders, that the test takers and the test score users. They offer a practical perspective, so they provide guardrails that we can use to audit AI use and mitigate the risks. So it's not just standards for the sake of standards, but these standards need processes in order to provide audits that mitigate risks and also expose any gaps, right? And from a scientific perspective, having these audits helps us to uphold the scientific integrity of the test in our case. And so what I'm hoping that you take away from this talk, and maybe you've taken away other things too, but 4 big takeaways, I think, are that having RAI standards in any field, and specifically for assessments, it demonstrates our professional responsibility in the community, above and beyond just providing a discussion. It's something concrete, and it helps our community make decisions to mitigate potential harms in the use of AI for assessment. It holds us accountable. And what's really important is that because AI is being updated all the time and changing, and it's moving very, very quickly, it's very important when, in the context of developing standards, is that they're not static, that we stay current, that we update them, and that not only will we update the standards, but that we update the practices along with the AI advances that we're maybe including or thinking about including in our assessments. And so I presented the information, and now what I'm curious about is I'd like you to think about RAI standards in your own setting. So what are relevant AI use cases? Do RAI guidelines or standards already exist in your context? Maybe I missed something. And we also want to let you know that you should feel free to use the RDET responsible AI standards for your organization. That's why we left them open. We left them open for comment. We would love it if you would go in and take a look at them and add your comments. If you go into the standards, there is a place to submit your comments, because we do plan to be updating them in the near future. And so we love to know what you're thinking, and perhaps include, your feedback in the new update of our standards. And I've included some references in the talk so that you can go back and look at what I've talked about here. And we have our research. You're welcome to scan this QR code, and you can find our research here. And I'm happy to now take questions. And I think, Sophie, you might have also wanted to post another.
Oh, we were going to invite people to share with us if they do have, examples of how they may be developing or using standards in their setting, you can use the chat. You can send it via Q&A. We'd love to hear from her, or you can email Jill. She loves to talk about this, so please email her if you want to continue the discussion. Jill, are you ready to take a few audience questions?
Sure, yeah.
Great. Okay, and just as a reminder, you can use the Q&A function to submit any question that you'd like for Jill to answer. We'll answer a few of these. We try not to make the webinars too long, so if there's something you're dying to discuss or it's a little bit more in detail, please do reach out to us, because we love to continue this conversation. Let me see. Here's kind of a broad one, Jill, to kind of get started. What is the primary target audience for the DET's responsible AI standards? Is it test takers, test users, fellow assessment research professionals, all of the above? Can you say a little bit more about who they're written for?
So the DET standards are written for us to keep us accountable, but at the same time, we hope that they reach other audiences. So we hope that they reach the larger assessment community. We hope that they reach other testing organizations. They're public, so test takers are welcome to take a look at them and just sort of know that they're there. Maybe some of the test takers have a sufficient background to understand the standards and their relevance. So we really hope that they're for the whole community, but I think the bottom line is that we hope that they're probably targeted more toward the educational measurement community and the assessment community at large.
Great.
That's helpful.
So another question is, in your description of the standards development process, you said that you identified relevant factors for language assessment. Can you describe how you identified those factors?
So we basically, I want to say that we've always done responsible AI. So we've always had these processes. And so the idea of the standards was to sort of formalize what we already had and make sure that we weren't missing anything. Now, having said that, what we did do was we looked at we looked at a lot of things, but one of the main documents that informed what we did here was the International Test Commission and ATP standards. And I think that, as well as the theoretical frameworks that are out there for language assessment that I presented earlier, such as, the Chappelle framework. And so I think that one of the main factors that plays into this is the domain, and making sure that, two things. One is the domain, so making sure that the AI that we use and how we use it is able to generate the kinds of content that we need for our international test taker population and for assessing language, right? And so I think the focus there in terms of pulling out factors would have mostly to do with the validity and reliability pieces, right? So I hope that answers the question. But you're welcome to go read the standards and let us know if anything is missing. So I'm not sure who the questions are coming from, but
I'm just kind of reading them anonymously.
Okay.
Some don't. So I'm just reading them all anonymously, everybody. And I have another one for you. Can or should RAI standards and assessment be incorporated into a validation framework? Or what is the relationship between RAI standards, and validity?
So we've actually, if you look at the standards, what we've done is we've actually taken the validity argument from the Chappelle work specifically, and we've created standards for each of them and sort of how they relate to the standards. And so we've basically we've embedded that work into the standards to make sure that the validity argument is represented in the context of the standards. And again, please feel free to go look at the standards and let us know if you have any comments about how we did that. But we did bring the validity argument into the standards, so to make sure that it's represented.
Okay, here's another question about developing standards. Do you think there's a need for a unified common RAI and assessment standards published by professional organizations, such as testing standards by AERA or NCME or something like that?
I think that would be helpful, yes. I do. I think that the standards now, as I pointed out, they address what was relevant when they were published in 2014, because the tests then used automated writing, scoring of writing and speaking, basically. But now we're using automated item generation, we're using AI in security, we're using AI for a lot of different aspects of the test above and beyond scoring. So I think that the standards at a minimum should be enhanced, updated.
And here's a question about the test taker side of things. Do the RAI standards encompass mitigating test taker use for AI of AI for cheating?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand that. Can you read that again?
Do the RAI standards that you've written encompass any ways to mitigate test takers using AI during the test, like for cheating? Is that something that it speaks to?
Well, yeah, I mean, even as part of the example that I showed for plagiarism, it's possible that, I don't know, somebody could draw something, I don't know, they could, I think it's hard because of the way that we monitor what's going on in the room and what's going on in the security part. So forget the plagiarism piece. I think this is a different question than I started to answer. So yes, we use AI to be able to identify if there are things going on the keyboard that shouldn't be, like maybe you're using ChatGPT, or if you're using another, the way it's done, it's secure. And so it's very difficult to use some kind of AI or some other application while you're taking the test. So it's part of the security piece. Yes. I think that answers the question. I think I started answering the wrong question at first.
That's fine. I've got one question from the chat, actually, which is, how do you communicate with stakeholders about AI development or about AI developed items or tests? What are the key aspects to focus on when communicating with stakeholders?
So I think we communicate with different kinds of stakeholders. So one of our stakeholders, obviously, is the research community. And so we communicate with them about what we're doing through our research publications, they're all posted at this link. Or this, if you scan, you'll go to our research page, and our publications are there. Sophie also writes really wonderful blogs about what we're doing with AI on the test. And so that reaches a broader audience of stakeholders. So that could be test takers, educators, anyone who's just interested in the Duolingo English test. Yeah, and webinars. So we try to reach as many stakeholders and different audiences as we can, so that there's clarity about, how the test is developed and scored, and, all the aspects that go into making a test and administering it.
I think we have time for maybe about 2 more questions before we wrap things up. And one is that you mentioned that the DET is digital first. Could you comment more about that? How does this approach differ from other assessments, which start initially with partially paper and pencil, or and then move to digital? What do you mean by digital first for a test?
Well, digital first is the fact that it's not just taking, something that was on paper and pencil and then digitizing it. It's actually, we're generating the items automatically. And of course, with human review, as I pointed out, we are scoring the items automatically. Everything is human reviewed, but everything is also automated. And so the importance of that has to do, feeds really into the test taker experience, which is something I talked about earlier, maybe went by quickly. But the fact that we use automated scoring means that the test time that you get your score is very, very fast. It's 48 hours. The cost of the test, because we use automated scoring, we use automated item generation, it's more affordable, right? Because this is a less expensive process for us. We use computer adaptive testing, which means the test is actually shorter. That's one thing. And so that's sort of where the computational psychometrics versus AI, and they sort of bleed into each other. There's a bit of overlap there. They work hand in hand. And yeah, so I mean, these are aspects of the test that I think are relevant to your question, and what the digital firstness is, right? So it's everything is automated. So it makes for a better test taker experience because of the speed, the score turnaround, the affordability, and also the fact that the test can be taken at home. So that's part of the security piece. But everything is digital. We say it's born digital, and so there are certain affordances of the AI that feed into an improved test taker experience, we think.
Thank you. And I'll ask one last question, and then I will encourage everybody else. I've got some kind of longer, more complex questions that I don't know if we have time to answer fully in this context, but I encourage you to reach out to Jill. Her email's right there. We would love to keep talking about this, but I'll ask one more that I think will benefit the whole group, which is, are there any resources that you'd recommend to familiarize yourself more with the role of AI in education?
Well, oh, wow. The role of AI in education. There is so much work about the role of AI in education right now. I don't know what your background is. If you attend something like NCME, that's a good place to learn about educational measurement and the role of AI. So I don't know if you attend different conferences or whatever, but I would just suggest that there is so much out there. And I don't know exactly what aspect. I'm not sure what the go-to reference would be for it, but I would just do some searching. I can actually, I hadn't really thought about this question before, and there's just such a prolific, like an incredibly large literature that I'm not sure what the go-to is, but I will think about it. And Sophie, do you know who asked the question? Maybe we can include it in a blog or something if you're interested what to read. But I mean, I would take a look at our blog. I would take a look at, some of our publications. There are other testing organizations that have a lot of publications out there. So maybe that's a good place to start, is just to look in those places. And reach out to me, because maybe I will have a better answer in a few days, because it is a very large literature.
Thank you.
We're just as a plug. I don't know if anybody goes to AAAI, but there are workshops. Like, we're doing a AAAI workshop on AI in education, and so there are a lot of not just our workshop, but there are a lot of workshops on AI in education. There's one affiliated with the SIG, with the Association for Computational Linguistics, which I'm a part of, and their workshop, if you go to their website, the SIG EDU workshop or website, they have a bunch of workshops that have been going on for years, and so there's literature there. So I just think there's a lot, and you just need to poke around. There's not one go-to place, I think, is the answer. So I feel bad I don't have like a single answer, but I think maybe start with us, look at other testing organizations, look around at the different conferences and proceedings, and that might be a good start.
Thank you. Anthony, would you like to say any
Well, I just want to say thanks to Jill for a wonderful exploration of this topic. This is a very hot topic for all of us, as this is upon us. And thank you once again, Jill.
Thanks for letting me talk about my passion, or one of them.
You're welcome. Sophie?
Sorry, that was a failed link. I was going to say, you can find this recording here, and then it didn't actually copy. One moment. Here's the link. You'll be able to find the recording of this webinar and all of the other webinars in this series at that link I just posted in the chat. That's the DET's Assessment Research YouTube channel. So check that out. There have been a lot of good talks and speakers that we've had in addition to Jill. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Jill's email is there if you want to keep on talking. I don't know if I'm pointing the right way, but we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to keep talking about this. And please stay tuned for future webinars in this series. Thank you so much.
Thanks.